Blessed day to all. In our previous discussion, you have learned about the concepts of frameworks, variables, and hypotheses. And if you could recall, we have several phases involving the quantitative process. And just for a quick review, here it is, our quantitative process. So we are actually done discussing the phase one, which is about the conceptual phase. And under that, we talk about how to formulate and delimit a problem, review related literature, conceptualize or develop framework, conceptual definitions, and hypotheses relating to your research. Having said that, I'd like to congratulate you guys for reaching this far. So we are now moving to the second phase of the quantitative process, which is the design and planning phase. Specifically, for our lesson today, I will be discussing the different research designs that you can use for your study. So let's begin. First, I'm sure you have heard of these terms already in conducting your previous research work: exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory. So let's be clarified with this first. So the amount of existing knowledge about the variables can be used as the criterion for classifying research as exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory. Although there can be an overlap between exploratory and descriptive studies, it is helpful to examine them separately. So in short, research can be classified as to any of these three depending on the amount of existing knowledge about the variables. First, exploratory studies. So they are conducted when little is known about the phenomenon of interest. So konti pa lang yung nalalaman natin or yung mga available related literature about the phenomenon of interest. So for instance, you might decide to examine the needs of family members of a patient who will be receiving IV antibiotics at home with treatments and interventions managed by family members. To determine what questions need to be asked, you would conduct a review of the literature. It is likely that you may find little data on this topic. An exploratory research study would therefore be appropriate and findings would add to the body of knowledge. So a flexible approach rather than a structured approach to data collection would be used. And in exploratory studies, there is an interest in examining the qualitative aspects of the data as well as the quantitative aspects. Hypotheses are generally not appropriate for this type of studies, and exploratory research is often qualitative in nature. However, a study with a large sample conducted in exploratory manner can be quantitative as well. Next, descriptive studies naman tayo. So, phenomena are described or the relationships between variables are examined. So, pagka descriptive, we are after um, or we are concerned in describing the relationships between variables. So a descriptive study is similar to an exploratory study. However, the two categories can be distinguished by considering the amount of information that is available about the variables under investigation. Kagaya ng sabi natin kanina, exploratory studies are appropriate when little is known about the area of interest. On the other hand, when enough information naman exists to examine the relationships between variables, then descriptive studies may be conducted, which hypothesis or in which hypotheses are tested. So we use hypothesis testing for descriptive studies. And explanatory studies naman search for causal explanations and are much more rigorous than exploratory or descriptive studies. So this type of research is usually experimental. Okay? Enough knowledge exists about the variables and their relationships that the investigator is able to exercise some degree of control over the research conditions and manipulate one or more of the variables. So again, pag explanatory, causal explanations tayo, and it is usually experimental. To summarize, exploratory and descriptive studies describe phenomena and examine relationships among phenomena, whereas explanatory studies help provide explanations for the relationships among phenomena. So may clue na tayo from the terms themselves, no? Explanatory, about explanation. Descriptive, it's about description. Exploratory, kapag konti yung information and you want to describe, so that is, again, exploratory. So let's just define what research methodology is. So it is considered to be the entire strategy for the study from identification of the problem to final plans for data collection. So in the case of your thesis, it is mainly evident in a specific chapter titled as Research Methodology, which include the research design section, your local, respondents, sampling technique, data gathering procedure, instruments, and finally, data analysis. So sa inyong thesis paper, iyon yung nilalaman ng research methodology. Kumbaga, si research methodology, that's one chapter, and for that chapter, it includes many sections, yung mga nabanggit ko kanina. So, yung research design section, local, respondent, sampling technique, etc. So, in short, um, research methodology discusses the steps and procedures that you will use in conducting your research. So, ito naman yung pangalawa. Yung una, research methodology. Next, another term is research design. So, it is the outline or plan for a research study. So, research design is the blueprint for conducting a study. So, blueprint for conducting a study. Just as the blueprint for a house must be individualized to the house being built, so the design must be made specific to a study. So this section describes the specific research approach you will use in the study. If or if for example, you choose or you will be using quantitative design, is it experimental ba or non-experimental? And then if it is experimental, for example, what type of experimental design? Is it through experiment, pre-experimental, or quasi-experimental? For example, napili nyo na is quasi-experimental. So, what type of quasi-experimental? So, you have to be specific. Ganun din, if you choose, for example, qualitative research design, so what specific type of research design ang gagamitin mo? Okay? So, you have to be guided by your problem statement or your SOP, your framework, and variables so you can map out the best design to achieve a detailed research plan for collecting and analyzing data. So again, it has to be congruent. Si SOP natin, si framework, tapos yung mga variables natin with our or with your research design. So kailangan aligned lahat sila. So, research design is concerned with the type of data that will be collected and the means used to obtain the needed data. For example, the researcher must decide if the study will try to determine causative factors, explore relationships, or examine historical data. So, the design must be appropriate to test the study hypothesis or hypothesis or answer the research questions. So that's how we distinguish research methodology from research design. Now, for your current study, sa thesis writing ninyo, now that you have an approved topic already, as we discuss this lesson, tignan nyo kung ano sa mga designs na madi-discuss natin yung best fit or applicable sa research nyo ngayon. So we are done with the overview. I structured this lesson into two parts. So in part one, we are going to discuss quantitative designs. So their criteria and specific types. And this is actually our focus. For part 2 naman, I'm just going to enumerate the different qualitative designs, but its detailed discussion will not be included in this video. And I think we are now ready. Let's begin with part 1, quantitative research designs. Although the terms exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory research can be used to determine the type of study being conducted, these terms do not clearly indicate the study plan or specific design. So there are several ways to classify research designs, and using Ms. Wiadomi and Bailey 2018 as our reference, we are going to discuss here the two broad categories of quantitative and qualitative designs. So for quantitative designs are divided into experimental and non-experimental designs. Again, sorry, yung two broad categories of quantitative designs, I'm referring to the two broad quantitative research designs, and that is experimental design and non-experimental designs, not not qualitative. It's just a typo error. So again, we are going to discuss here the two broad categories of quantitative designs, and that is experimental and non-experimental designs. So as presented in this table, we can see here the specific research design examples for either experimental, and under this, we have three major categories, including the true experimental design, quasi, and pre-experimental designs. And for non-experimental naman, we have these designs. But we are only going to discuss si comparative studies, survey, and correlational studies. Ayan. So all of this, again, fall under the quantitative research design. Okay, so lahat ito, quantitative research design. So it can either be experimental. So for experimental, it can be through experiment, quasi, or pre-experiment. And then for non-experimental, ito yung ating mga several types for that. So let's first focus our attention with experimental designs. So experimental research is concerned with cause and effect relationships. Again, experimental research, cause and effect relationships. A cause and effect relationship occurs when one object or event makes some other object or event happen. For example, weight gain could be considered an effect or object as a side effect of taking certain medications, which is our cause. Note that all experimental studies involve manipulation or control of the independent variable, which is our cause, and measurement of the dependent variable, which is our effect. Although experimental research designs are highly respected in the scientific world, causal relations are difficult to establish. Again, yung cause and effect relationship is quite difficult to establish. Controls are difficult to apply when experimental research is conducted with human being. So this is one of the reasons that many nursing studies have employed non-experimental designs. So in an experiment, also called as randomized controlled trial or RCT, researchers are active agents, not passive observers. So the controlled experiment is considered to be the gold standard for yielding reliable evidence about causes and effects. Experimenters can be relatively confident in the genuineness of causal relationships because they are observed under controlled conditions and typically meet the criteria for establishing causality. And again, remember that experimental research is concerned in cause and effect relationships. So experiment, also termed as RCT or randomized controlled trial. In experimental studies as well as in other types of research, the researcher is interested in controlling extraneous variables that can influence study results. So pag sinabing extraneous variables, they are those variables that the researcher is unable to control or does not choose to control, and in which can influence the results of a study. So other names for extraneous variables are confounding and intervening. So these variables are also called study limitations. So the researcher acknowledges these study limitations in the discussion section of a research report. And finally, in experimental studies, the extraneous variables or competing explanations for the results are labeled threats to internal and external validity. Again, sa experimental studies, yung extraneous variables natin or competing explanations for the results, ang tawag natin doon ay threats to the internal or external validity. We are now going to discuss here the validity of experimental design. So, internal validity muna tayo. So, internal validity of an experimental design concerns the degree to which changes in the dependent variable or effect can be attributed to the cause or to the independent variable. So that is internal validity. The degree to which changes in the dependent variable can be attributed to the independent variable. So, ibig sabihin, internal validity yung nag-cause talaga ng change sa ating dependent variable is our independent variable. Now, threats to internal validity are factors other than the independent variable that influence the dependent variable. So these factors constitute rival explanations or competing hypotheses that might explain the study results. So yung mga threats na ito, sila yung pwedeng makaapekto sa dependent variable other than independent variable. And as much as possible, kinokontrol or ini-eliminate natin yung mga threats or factors na ito sa isang controlled or experimental research. So external validity naman concerns the degree to which study results can be generalized to other people and other settings. Kung valid ba yung results or findings sa ibang tao or settings, since in quantitative studies, we are also concerned with the generalizability of the results. So these kinds of questions should be answered about external validity. With what degree of confidence can the study findings be transferred from the sample to the entire population? Will these study findings hold true with other groups in other times and places? So, yun yung mga sample questions na pwede nating itanong for the external validity. Internal and external validity are related in that as the researcher attempts to control for internal validity, external validity is usually decreased. Conversely, when the researcher is concerned with external validity naman, or the generalizability of the findings to other settings and other people, the strict control necessary for high internal validity may be affected. So therefore, the researcher must decide how to balance internal and external validity. Before we discuss the different experimental designs, threats to internal and external validity are addressed so we can better determine the strengths and weaknesses of the various designs as we discuss them in this lesson. So pag-usapan muna natin yung mga threats. Okay? First, threats to internal validity. So Campbell and Stanley 1963 and Cook and Campbell 1975 have identified threats to the internal validity of a study. So we are going to discuss 6 of these threats. First, we have selection bias. So this threat occurs when study results are attributed to the experimental treatment or the researcher's manipulation of the independent variable when in fact the results are related to subject differences before the independent variable was manipulated. Again, so the results are related to subject differences before the IV was manipulated. So nangyayari to sa experimental studies when subjects are not randomly assigned to experimental and comparison groups. So we can control this threat by randomly assigning participants to experimental and control group. For example, suppose the researcher decides to offer a seminar to help people stop cigarette smoking. 15 volunteers are obtained who indicate they would like to stop smoking. This group is designated as the experimental group. 15 other people are recruited who have not shown a desire to stop smoking. So this group becomes the control group naman. The 15 subjects in the experimental group may have been more motivated to stop smoking before the treatment than the 15 subjects in the control group. So the selection process for the groups may therefore have biased the eventual results of the study. So again, para maiwasan yung bias na ito, we have to randomly assign the respondents into experimental and control group. By the way, we will learn more about kung ano ba yung control at experimental groups na ito later. Second, we have history. So the threat of history or history threat occurs when some evidence besides the experimental treatment occurs during the course of a study, and this event influences the dependent variable. So ibig sabihin, may pangyayari na naka-influence sa DV natin. Hindi lang yung IV yung nag-cause ng change na yon. So for instance, a researcher might be interested in determining the incidence of breast self-examination or BSE among women after they attend a 3-week teaching program on BSE. During the time the study is being conducted, an article is published in the newspaper concerning the rise in the number of women with breast cancer. So this history event could result in an increase in the incidence of BSE behaviors. At the conclusion of the study, the researcher would not be able to determine if the teaching program, which is our IV, was the reason for the increase in the incidence of PSE, which is our DV, or if the newspaper article was the impetus for an increase in PSE among the study subjects. And then how do we now control history threats? By the inclusion of at least one simultaneous control or comparison group in a study. Additionally, random assignment of subjects to groups helps control the threat of history. Third, we have maturation. So the third threat to internal validity is maturation. So it becomes a threat when changes that occur within the subjects during an experimental study influence the study results. So people may become older, taller, or sleepier, for example, from the time of the pre-test to post-test. Halimbawa, if a school nurse were interested in the weight gain of children who receive a hot breakfast at school each day, she would have to keep in mind that changes may occur in these children during the course of the study that are not related to the experimental treatment. So the children will probably gain some weight as they eat more and grow older, regardless of whether they eat a hot breakfast at school or not. So in general, lumalaki talaga sila during this stage. So again, a comparison group of similar children helps control for this threat para meron tayong napaghahambingan. So maturation processes are then as likely to occur in one group as in another. So that's how we control the threat, the maturation threat, no? So having a comparison group. Fourth, we have testing. So the testing threat may occur in studies where a pretest is given or where subjects have knowledge of baseline data. So kapag tayo ay may pretest or si subject have a knowledge of baseline data, so that is testing threats. So nangyayari ito kapag magpapa-pretest muna si researcher sa mga respondents tapos magbibigay ng post-test. So testing refers to the influence of the pretest or knowledge of baseline data on the post-test scores. Subjects may remember the answers they put on the pretest and put the same answers on the post-test. Also, subjects' scores may be altered on the post-test as a result of their knowledge of baseline data. For example, if subjects were weighed and told their weight before an experimental weight reduction program, so these subjects might make some effort on their own to lose weight because they have discovered they are overweight. So this knowledge of baseline data could be considered a pretest. So that is a testing threat. Next, instrumentation change. So when mechanical instruments or judges are used in the pretest and post-test phases of a study, the threat of instrumentation must be considered. So instrumentation change involves the difference between the pretest and post-test measurement caused by a change in the accuracy of the instrument or the judge's ratings, rather than as a result of the experimental treatment. So judges kasi may become more adept at the ratings or on the contrary become tired and make less exact observations. How do we now control instrumentation change threats? By training sessions for judges and trial runs to check for fatigue factors may help control for instrumentation changes. Also, if mechanical instruments are used naman, such as sphygmomanometers, these instruments should be checked for their accuracy throughout the study. The last threat for internal validity is mortality. So the mortality threat occurs when the subjects do not complete a study. So attrition or dropout may occur in any research study. So the observed effects may occur because the subjects who drop out of a particular group are different from those who remained in the study. Example natin, if a large number of experimental group subjects who scored very high on an anxiety pretest drop out of the study, the average anxiety scores on the post-test for the experimental group might be deceivingly low. So the researcher might falsely conclude that the treatment really worked well. Take note that there is no research design that will control for mortality because for ethical reasons, participants can never be forced to remain in a study. So the longer a study lasts, the more likely the subject dropout will occur. Now, Hanson and Lyosa 2015 suggested that subjects drop out of studies due to lack of interest and motivation. So this may be of particular concern in randomization where subjects drop out of one group at a rate higher than another group. For example, if the dependent variable was depression, it is possible that people with the highest or lowest levels of depression would be the ones to drop out of the study. So how to control for this threat? The researcher should try to establish a relationship with the study participants and help them recognize the importance of their continued participation in a particular study. So kung may internal validity, punta naman tayo sa external naman. So external validity na tayo. So Campbell and Stanley, 1963, have identified four threats to external validity. And Brack and Glass, 1968, delineated 10 threats naman to the external validity of a study. We're going to discuss three external validity threats. Okay, so first we have the Hawthorne effect. So the Hawthorne effect occurs when a study participants respond in a certain manner because they are aware that they are being observed. Hawthorne effect, they are aware that they are being observed. Okay, yung mga respondents natin. So this term came about as the result of the studies on worker productivity at the Hawthorne plant of the Western Electric Company. So working conditions such as changing the length of the working day were varied. Worker productivity was found to increase no matter what changes were made. So the increase in productivity was finally determined to be the result of the subject's knowledge that they were involved in a research study and that someone was interested in them. So yun pala yung naging reason nila why their productivity, their um, working productivity has increased. They notice or they knew that they are being observed. Kaya mas parang ginanahan sila or mas nagporsige sila to work more. So the Hawthorne effect may also be considered a threat to internal validity. So it might be possible to control this threat by using a double-blind experiment. So in a double-blind experiment, neither the researcher nor the research respondents or participants are aware of which participants are in the experimental group and which participants are in the control group. So, hindi alam ni respondents, hindi rin alam ni researcher kung sino yung mapupunta sa control group and experimental group. Second, we have the experimenter effect. So, ito naman is a threat to study results that occur occurs when researcher characteristics or behaviors influence subject behaviors. Yung behavior ni researcher naka-influence sa behavior ni subject. Examples of research characteristics or behaviors that may be influential are facial expressions, clothing, age, gender, and body build. Although the term experimenter effect is appropriate to use only when discussing experimental research, a term with a similar meaning is used in non-experimental research. So we have the Rosenthal effect for the non-experimental, named after the person who identified this phenomenon. It is used to indicate the influence of an interviewer on respondents' answers. So it has been shown that the researcher characteristics such as gender, dress, and type of jewelry may influence study participants' answers to questions in non-experimental studies. So magkaiba lang ng term pero they mean the same, no? Yung influence ni researcher sa ating mga respondents or subjects during research. So again, for experimental research, it's experimenter effect. For non-experimental, it's Rosenthal effect. Third, we have the reactive effects of the pretest. So when a pretest and posttest are used in an experimental study, the researcher must be aware not only of the internal validity threat that may occur, but also of the external validity threat that may exist. So the reactive effects of the pretest occur when subjects have been sensitized to the treatment because they took the pretest. So this sensitization may affect the post-test results. People might not respond to the treatment in the same manner if they had not received a pretest. So the pretest does not have to be from a questionnaire-like test. As mentioned previously, di ba, in our example, if study participants were told their weight prior to a weight reduction study, this knowledge of baseline data would be considered a pretest. And that's about it, no, for the internal and external validity. So they are important to note since these concepts can heavily influence experimental designs. Next, we have symbolic presentation of research designs. So research designs are often easier to understand when seen in a symbolic form. So the symbols used to depict the designs in this discussion are based on the notation scheme of Campbell and Stanley, 1963. So R is our random assignment of subjects to groups. Pag nakita niyo yung R na symbol, it refers to random assignment of subjects to groups. So inassign natin yung ating subjects randomly sa grupo, either experimental or control group. Next, you have the X. Pag nakita naman yung X, this is for experimental treatments or intervention. So, ibig sabihin, nagbigay tayo ng experimental treatment or intervention. And then yung O naman, for observation or measurement of dependent variable. So the X and O's on one line apply to a specific group. So the time sequence of events is related, is read from left to right. Again, the time sequence of event is read from left to right. And then if an X appears first and then O, this means that the intervention occurred first, then an observation was made. Tapos, if a subscript appears after an X or O, such as X sub 1, X sub 2, O sub 1, O sub 2, the numbers indicate the first treatment, second treatment, first observation, second observation, and so forth. So, yan yung ating symbolic presentation for research design. To make it clear, let's have this an example. So we have this symbol, no, these symbols for our example. So this example has two groups, experimental on top and comparison below. So both of which were formed through random assignment as indicated by R. Okay? So ito yung R na to, random assignment yung ng ating mga subjects either to experimental tsaka control group. So pag sinabing random assignment pala, it is a procedure that ensures that each subject has an equal chance of being assigned or placed in any of the groups in experimental study. So, both groups, no, itong experimental tsaka comparison group, were measured or given a pretest as indicated by O sub 1. Okay? So, parehong grupo may O sub 1. Ibig sabihin, we had pretest on the phenomenon of interest or our dependent variable. And then the experimental group was exposed to an experimental treatment. So again, the IV, the experimental group was exposed to an experimental treatment, which is our independent variable as indicated by this X. So the comparison group, on the other hand, was not exposed to this treatment. Kaya wala tayong X dito. So sa experimental group lang yung merong X. Ibig sabihin, na ibigay sa kanya yung treatment or yung intervention, which is our independent variable. Then, after which both groups were again measured or given the post-test. So, nag-observe ulit tayo, nagbigay tayo ng post-test as indicated by O sub 2, parehong grupo on the phenomenon of interest or our dependent variable. So that's how we read this symbolic representation. So again, we have two groups here. Both for each group, yung mga subjects natin were assigned randomly. And then we had pre-tests for both groups. And then we gave experimental treatment to the experimental group while we do not have or we did not give the intervention to the comparison group. After which, nag-observe ulit tayo, which is indicated by O sub 2 for both experimental and comparison group. So that is for our symbolic presentation example. Now that we know all of those concepts, we can proceed to the first category of an experimental design, which is true experimental designs. So the true experimental designs are those in which the researcher has a great deal of control over the research situation. Threats to the internal validity of the study are minimized. Only with the use of true experimental designs may causality be inferred with any degree of confidence. So with these types of designs, the researcher has some confidence that the independent variable was the cause of the change in the dependent variable. So a true experimental design has three criteria. First, you have the researcher manipulates the experimental variables, and that is manipulation. Second, at least one experimental and one comparison group are included in the study, also known as comparison or the control group criterion. And then the third, subjects are randomly assigned to either the experimental or the comparison group. And that is the third criterion, random assignment. So isa-isahin natin. Let's talk the first criterion, the manipulation or the intervention. So it involves doing something to study participants. Again, pag sinabing manipulation, it involves doing something to the study participants. Experimenters manipulate the independent variable by administering treatment or intervention to some people and withholding it from others, or kaya administering a different treatment. So the experimental treatment in nursing research usually concerns some type of nursing intervention. The researcher manipulates the IV or nursing intervention by administering it to some subjects and withholding it from others. The DV naman or the effects of the nursing intervention is then observed. So example, suppose we are investigating the effect of gentle massage, our independent variable, compared to no massage, our control, on pain levels, that is our dependent variable, in nursing home residents, which is our respondents. Participants in the experimental group receive gentle massage. Again, sa experimental group, they will receive the gentle massage. Whereas sa control group naman, they will not have that intervention. So, wala silang makukuhang massage. So, this design permits us to see if changes in pain were caused by the massage because only some people receive it, providing an important comparison. So, in this example, we met the first criterion of a true experiment by varying massage receipt, the independent variable. So we manipulated here the IV by giving the intervention, the gentle massage, to one group of respondents and withholding it, yung no massage, to another group. So that is for the first criterion, the manipulation. Second, we have second criterion for a true experimental design is the use of a comparison or control group. So the term control group is seen more frequently in the literature than the term comparison group. So pag sinabing control group, usually indicates a group in an experimental study that does not receive the experimental treatment. So remember, in nursing research, the withholding of treatment may be unethical. That's why the comparison or the control group usually receives the normal or routine intervention na tinatawag natin. So again, experimental group, sila yung grupo na nakaka-receive ng experimental treatment or intervention. Yung control group naman, sila yung hindi nakaka-receive or oftentimes um, ang nare-receive nila ay yung standard or yung usual treatment. Again, yung control group, hindi nila nare-receive yung experimental intervention or treatment. Ang nare-receive nila ay yung standard or yung usual treatment lang. Example, in this previous one, nabanggit natin kanina na to, the nursing home residents in the control group receives no massage. Yung control group natin, they will receive no massage. So the control group again will be used to evaluate the performance of the experimental group. Okay, the group getting the intervention, which is the gentle massage, on the same outcome. Okay, so si experimental group, sila yung makaka-receive ng gentle massage. Si control group, no massage yung sa kanila naman. Wala tayong, it's we withheld the treatment or the intervention to the control group. So very quickly, let's just talk the control conditions that the researchers can use to that can use to our control group. So the one not receiving the experimental treatment. So to give an intervention a fair test, researchers need to design one that is of sufficient intensity and duration that effects on the outcome might reasonably be expected. So researchers have choices about what to use as the control condition. Among the possibilities for the control condition are the following. First, you have the usual care or the standard methods of care. So this is the usual procedures used to care for patients. Okay? So again, ito pinag-uusapan natin ay yung mga control conditions na pwede nating ibigay to the control group. So, usual care or standard methods of care, ito yung mga usual na ginagawa natin sa ating mga pasyente. So, pwede natin yung ibigay to our control group. Letter B, you have an alternative treatment. For example, you may use music versus massage. So, the risk is that the results will be inconclusive because it may be difficult to detect the differential effects of two good treatments kapag ito yung pipiliin nyo, alternative treatment. Letter C, a placebo or pseudo intervention presumed to have no therapeutic value. Again, pag sinabing placebo or tawag natin pseudo intervention, it presumed to have no therapeutic value. For example, in studies of the effectiveness of drugs, some patients get the experimental drug and others get an innocuous substance. So placebos are used to control for the non-pharmaceutical effects of drugs, such as the attention being paid to participants. So there can, however, be what we call as placebo effects, changes in the dependent variable attributable to the placebo condition because of the participants' expectations of benefits or harms. So yun yung placebo effects natin. Ano? So there's a change in the dependent variable because of the expectation of the participants doon sa benefits or harm na ibinigay sa kanila. Letter D, attention control condition. So the control group gets attention, but not the intervention's active ingredients. And then letter E, delayed treatment or wait list control group. Example, control group members are wait listed and exposed to the intervention at a later point. Ethically attractive to, but is not always feasible. So the control group eventually receives the full experimental intervention after all research outcomes are assessed. So yun yung sa ating delayed treatment or waitlist control group. So yun yung mga pwedeng gamitin for our control group. Kasi nga, hindi natin binibigay yung experimental intervention sa kanila. So you can choose among here kung ano yung pwedeng i-administer sa kanila. Usual care ba yan, alternative treatment, placebo, attention control condition, or delayed treatment? Okay, so tuloy tayo sa pangatlong criterion. The last criterion for true experimental studies is the random assignment of subjects to group or to groups. So random assignment ensures that each subject has an equal chance of being placed into any of the groups in an experimental study. So researchers typically either use computers to perform the randomization. So at this point, be aware that random assignment concerns the equality of groups in experimental studies. So the random assignment of subjects to group eliminates selection bias as a threat to internal validity of the study. Random assignment of people to one group or the other is designed to perform this equalization function. So one method might be to flip a coin. For example, if the coin comes up heads, a participant would be assigned to one group. If it comes up tails, she would be assigned to the other group. So pwedeng ganon yung ating pag-assign sa mga subjects. Take note of this. Although randomization is the preferred method for equalizing groups, there is actually no guarantee that the groups will be equal at all. So there is a lot of confusion about random assignment versus random sampling. Pag sinabing random assignment, it is a signature of an experimental design or our randomized controlled trial. If subjects are not randomly assigned to intervention groups, then the design is not true experiment. So again, random assignment, signature siya ng ating experimental design. Pag sinabi namang random sampling, it refers to a method of selecting people for a study. So random sampling is not a signature of an experimental design. And in fact, most RCTs do not involve random sampling. And we will learn more about random sampling when we reach the sampling technique lesson. Okay, so we now proceed to the first true experimental design. So pag-usapan na natin yung mga designs na meron tayo under the true experiment. So first you have the pre-test, post-test control group design. Pre-test, post-test control group design. So this is also termed as before and after design, and is probably the most frequently used experimental design. So in this design, the subjects are randomly assigned to groups as indicated by this R. So randomly assigned yung ating mga subjects to groups. Ito yung experimental, ito yung comparison group. So random yung pag-assign natin sa respondents. B, a pretest is given to both groups as indicated by O sub 1 for both groups. So, meron tayong O sub 1 sa parehong grupo. Ibig sabihin, nagbigay tayo ng pretest sa parehong group. And then, the experimental group receives the experimental treatment and the comparison group receives the routine treatment or no treatment as indicated by X dito. For the experimental group, ibig sabihin, nagbigay tayo ng experimental treatment. While dito sa comparison group, wala tayong treatment na binigay. And then yung last, a post-test is given to both groups as indicated by this O sub 2. So, after magbigay ng treatment or mag-withheld naman sa comparison group, inobserve natin uli sila pareho. Okay, using a post-test. So, that is a pre-test, post-test control group design. So, yun yung ating mga criteria or ginagawa for this type of design. So, the researcher is able to determine if the groups were equal before the treatment was administered. If the groups were not equivalent, so the post-test scores may be adjusted statistically to control for the initial differences between the two groups that were reflected in the pre-test scores. Example natin, a nurse researcher might be interested in the usefulness of a diabetic teaching film. A group of clients with diabetes are randomly assigned to the experimental or comparison group. So both groups are then pre-tested on their knowledge of diabetes. Members of the experimental group watch the diabetic teaching film. Members of the comparison group naman are asked to read printed material that is similar to the information covered in the teaching film. So both groups are then post-tested on their knowledge of diabetes. And finally, the difference between the post-test scores of the two groups is compared. So that is for our examples of pre-test, post-test control group design. So it controls for all threats to internal validity. Itong design na to controls for all threats to internal validity. The disadvantage of this design concerns the external threat of the reactive effects of the pretest since nagbibigay tayo ng pretest. The results of the study can be generalized only to situations in which a pretest would be administered before the treatment. Second design, we have post-test only control group design, also known as after-only design. So ito yung mga ginagawa natin for this design. Subjects are randomly assigned to groups indicated by R. So dalawa uli yung grupo natin. So subjects are randomly assigned sa parehong grupo, or I mean to one group, and then the experimental group receives the experimental treatment and the comparison group receives the routine treatment or no treatment as indicated by X for the experimental and none for the comparison group. And then a post-test is given to both groups as indicated by observation O sub 1 or observation 1 for each group. So, ibig sabihin, wala tayong pretest for this one, no? So, kaya tinawag siyang post-test only control group design. So, some researchers argue that pretesting is not always necessary, especially when randomization is used. In many nursing studies, it may be inappropriate or impossible to pretest before the independent variable is manipulated. So the post-test only control group design is easier to carry out and superior to the pretest post-test design. So the researcher does not have to be concerned with the reactive effects of the pretest on the post-test kasi wala nga tayong pretest. And then the generalizability of the results would be more extensive. Example natin dito, a study similar to the example described regarding the pretest post-test control group design could be developed. So the only difference would be that the two groups would not receive a pretest on their knowledge of diabetes. Yung example natin kanina. So wala lang silang pretest. So random assignment of subjects into groups in the post-test only control group design helps to ensure equality of the groups. The use of a large sample size will increase the effectiveness of random assignment. Although random assignment should ensure equality of groups, the researchers seem to be fearful that the groups may not in fact be similar. Therefore, they sometimes choose to administer a pretest. So si post-test only control group design should be used when it is not possible to administer a pretest or when it would not make sense to administer a pretest. And then yung pangatlo, we have Solomon for group design. So as the name implies, dito we have 4 groups, just like in this symbols or in this diagram. So we have 4 groups, 2 experimental, and then 2 for the comparison group. So ano yung design for ano ginagawa natin for the Solomon 4 group? So first, subjects are randomly assigned to one of the 4 groups. So yan, lahat tayo may R for the random assignment of subjects. So 2 of the groups, experimental group 1 and comparison group 1 are pre-tested. So in this case, meron tayong dalawang pre-test. That is for experimental group 1 and comparison group 1. 2 of the groups, and in this case, experimental group 1, experimental group 2 to, no? Okay. So for the letter C criteria or um, tawag dito, intervention. So, 2 of the groups, si experimental group 1 and experimental group 2, receives the experimental treatment. So, meron tayong experimental treatment. Kasi nga, they are experimental group. So, we administered the intervention to experimental group 1 and experimental group 2. Whereas yung 2 of the groups, yung comparison group 1 and comparison group 2 receive the routine treatment or no treatment. Okay, so that's the third na ginagawa natin for Solomon for group design. And then the third criterion, I mean the fourth one is a post-test is given to all four groups. Okay, so meron tayong O sub 2 here indicating a post-test for all the groups. So ito yung lahat ng criteria na ginagawa natin to indicate that it is a Solomon for group design. So, Solomon for group design is considered to be the most prestigious experimental design because it minimizes threats to internal and external validity. So that is the most prestigious experimental design. So this design not only controls for all of the threats to internal validity, but also controls for the reactive effects of the pre-test. So any differences between the experimental and the comparison groups can be more confidently associated with the experimental treatment. So unfortunately, this design requires a large sample and statistical analysis of the data is complicated. So medyo mahirap lang talagang conduct yung Solomon for group design. So only one Solomon for group design could be located in the nursing literature of the past 5 years, according to Ms. Viadomi and Bailey, 2018. Advantages and disadvantages of experiments. So ano yung mga pros and cons ng true experiments? By the way, yun yung tatlo, no, na under true experimental designs. Actually, meron pa yan. Pero these are the most common na ginagamit, no? So you have the pre-test and post-test control group design, the post-test only control group design, and you have the Solomon for group design. So ano yung mga advantages of experiments or true experimental design? So as previously mentioned, RCTs, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for intervention studies or therapy questions because they yield the most persuasive evidence about the effects of an intervention. So through randomization to groups, researchers come as close as possible to attaining an ideal counterfactual. And the great strength of experiments lies in the confidence with which causal relationships can be inferred. So through controls imposed by intervening, comparing, and especially randomizing, alternative explanations can often be ruled out. So for this reason, meta-analysis of RCTs, which integrate evidence from multiple experimental studies, are at the pinnacle of evidence hierarchies for questions relating to causes. So, ano yung mga disadvantages ng experiments? Number one, many interesting variables simply are not amenable to intervention. So, a large number of human traits, such as disease or health habits, cannot be randomly conferred. That is why RCTs are not at the top of the hierarchy for prognosis questions, which concern the consequence of health problem. For example, infants could not be randomly assigned to having cystic fibrosis to see if this disease causes poor psychosocial adjustment. Second disadvantage natin, many variables could technically but not ethically be experimentally varied. For example, there have been no RCTs to study the effect of cigarette smoking on lung cancer. Such a study would require people to be assigned randomly to a smoking group, or people forced to smoke, or a non-smoking group, people prohibited from smoking. And then yung pangatlo natin, sometimes RCTs are not feasible because of practical issues. It may, for instance, be impossible to secure the administrative approval to randomize people to groups. So in summary, the experimental designs have some limitations that restrict their use for some real-world problems. Nevertheless, RCTs have a clear superiority to other designs for testing causal hypotheses. So, how can you tell if a study is experimental? So researchers usually indicate in the method section of their reports that they use an experimental or randomized design or RCT. If such terms are missing, you can conclude that a study is experimental if the article says that the study purpose was to test the effects of an intervention and if participants were put into groups at random. So, yun yung makakapagsabi sa inyo na experimental na siya. Again, kung we put the participants um, into groups at random. Okay, yung randomization natin. That is one. And if the purpose is to test the effect of an intervention. So much for that. We now proceed to the second major category of experimental research design, which is quasi-experimental. So it is also called as trials without randomization in the medical literature. So there are those, itong ating quasi-experimental designs are those in which there is either no comparison group or subjects are not randomly assigned to groups. Again, quasi-experimental design, it's either wala tayong comparison group or hindi tayo nag-random assignment sa ating subjects sa grupo. So the researcher uses existing or intact groups for the experimental and comparison groups. It involves an intervention, just like through experiments. However, yun na nga, quasi-experimental designs lack randomization, which is the signature of a true experiment. Ano yung advantage ni quasi? By conducting experiments with naturally occurring groups, the real world is more closely approximated than when subjects are randomly assigned to groups. So, mas practical, kumbaga si quasi. So, the quasi-experimental design is weaker. Okay, that is a disadvantage because without randomization, it cannot be assumed that the experimental and comparison groups are equivalent at the onset. So causal inferences cannot be made as readily as with RCTs or doon sa ating true experimental design kanina. So first design under quasi, we have non-equivalent control group design. So the non-equivalent control group design is similar to the pretest post-test control group design except there is no random assignment of subjects to the experimental and comparison groups. So wala tayong makikitang R in our representation. Kanina kasi di ba previously in our pretest post-test control group design, may R dito. Pero since non-equivalent control group design ito, so walang R tayong makikita. Wala tayong random assignment or randomization sa ating mga subjects to one of the group, either experimental or sa comparison. Okay, so hindi tayo nag-assign randomly. So, ayun, yun lang yung pinagkaiba. So, we still have experimental tsaka comparison group. Um, the The intervention or the experimental treatment is given to the experimental group. The comparison group will receive none. And then we gave post test after the treatment, no, or after the intervention to the experimental group, or after the usual care, or the standard treatment for the comparison group naman. Example, suppose we wish to study the effect of a chair yoga intervention. That is our independent variable for older people, which is our participant, on quality of life, which is our outcome. So the intervention is being offered to everyone at a community senior center. Again, the intervention is being offered to everyone at a community senior center, and randomization is not possible. For comparative purposes, we collect outcome data at the different senior center that is not instituting the intervention. Data on quality of life are collected from both groups at baseline or pre-test, and 10 weeks later, that is our post-test. So the design is nevertheless strong because the baseline data allow us to see whether elders in the two senior centers had similar quality of life scores on average before the intervention. If the groups are comparable at baseline, we could be relatively confident in inferring that post-test differences in quality of life were the result of the yoga intervention. If quality of life scores are different initially, however, post-intervention differences are hard to interpret. So threats to internal validity control are, we have history, so testing, maturation, and instrumentation change. So yun yung nape-prevent ni non-equivalent control group design. History, testing, maturation, and instrumentation change. The biggest threat to internal validity naman ay selection bias. Since wala tayong random assignment, the threat to the internal validity, the threat to internal validity is selection bias. So as the two groups may not be similar at the beginning of the study, it is possible to test statistically for differences in the groups. So for example, it could be determined if the ages and educational backgrounds of the subjects in both groups were similar. If the groups were similar at the beginning of the study, so more confidence could be placed in a cause and effect relationship between variables. A statistical test called analysis of covariance, or ANCOVA, can be used to help control for differences that might have existed through chance between the experimental and control groups at the beginning of the study. So, pwede tayong gumamit ng ANCOVA. Kung sa una pa lang, we have seen differences for the control group and the experimental group. So second design, still under quasi-experimental, is time series design. So for this, the researcher periodically observes or measures the subjects. So the experimental treatment is administered between two of the observations. So wala tayong comparison group dito. So as you can see in the symbol, we have 3 observations before the treatment, and then another 3 observations after giving the treatment or intervention. So we only have, again, one group. So wala tayong comparison dito. So example dito, a researcher might assess the pain levels of a group of clients with low back pain. After 3 weeks of pain assessment, so that is observation 1, observation 2, observation 3. So O sub 1, O sub 2, O sub 3, kasi 3 weeks of pain assessment, right? So subjects could be taught a special exercise to alleviate low back pain. So that is our intervention or treatment. And then during the next 3 weeks, pain levels would again be measured. And that would be O sub 4, O sub 5, O sub 6. So the results of this study would help the researcher determine if low back pain persists, if a specific exercise is effective in reducing low back pain, and if effectiveness of the exercise persists. So the time series design with its numerous observations or measurements of the dependent variable helps strengthen the validity of the design. So the greatest threats to validity are history and testing. The last major category of experimental design is the pre-experimental design. So it is the name applied by Campbell and Stanley 1963 to experimental designs that are considered very weak and in which the researcher has a little control over the research. Sometimes these types of designs are discussed to provide examples of how not to do research. So first we have one-shot case study. Okay, so this is the first design under pre-experimental. So one-shot case study, a single group is exposed to an experimental treatment and observed after the treatment. Okay, so single group lang tayo. Tapos, nagbigay ka ng experimental treatment, tapos you observe the group after the treatment. So, ganun lang kasimple. A group of patients with diabetes might attend a diabetic education class. So, that will be our treatment or our intervention and then be tested on their knowledge of diabetes. So, that is our observation after the class is completed. Or that is our post-test, kumbaga. So there is no way to determine if the level of knowledge about diabetes was the result of the class. So the patients could have already possessed this knowledge before the class. Kasi nga hindi naman tayo nag-pretest din. So threats to internal validity for one-shot case study are history, maturation, and selection bias. So the threats of testing and instrumentation change would not be applicable in this setting. And then selection bias would be a very serious threat in this particular design. So the one-shot case study is the weakest of all the experimental designs because it controls for no threats to internal validity. So no example of this type of study was found in the recent nursing literature. Second, we have the one group pre-test, post-test design. So for this one, it provides a comparison between a group of subjects before and after the experimental treatment. So just like yung kanina, we only have one group, pero this time we have a pre-test, no? So may pre-test tayo, tsaka after the pre-test, nagbigay tayo ng experiment or ng treatment, and then afterwards, we gave post-test. So a group of patients with diabetes could be given a pre-test of their diabetes knowledge, that is our observation one. And then this group would then attend the diabetic education class, which is our X or our treatment or intervention, and then be post-tested, that is our observation two, at the end of the class. So threats to internal validity would be history, maturation, testing, and instrumentation change. So note this design has two threats that were not applicable in the last design sa ating one-shot case study. because of the existence of pre-test and post-test. Testing and instrumentation change now become threats to internal validity. And we have completed our discussion with experimental designs. So, tapos na tayo. Na-discuss na natin si experimental designs and all the examples or the specific designs under them. So, okay na tayo doon. We now proceed to the non-experimental designs. So, only three will be discussed in this lesson. You have the comparative studies, the survey studies, and the correlational studies. So, start na tayo ng experimental designs. So, nurse researchers have made great use of the non-experimental, also termed as observational in medical literature, research designs. So, many times, experimental research cannot be conducted with human beings because of ethical results in trying to determine clients' perceptions of pain. The only way to obtain this information would be to ask these clients about their pain. An experimental study would not be appropriate. So, all non experimental research is descriptive because there is no manipulation or control of variables, and the researcher can describe the phenomenon only as it exists. Although the researcher cannot talk about a cause and effect relationship in non experimental research, it is important to obtain um, valid study results in this type of research. So the researcher must attempt to control for extraneous variables through such means as careful selection of the study sample. So threats to internal validity and external validity are the terms that are reserved for use in discussing experimental studies. However, in non-experimental research, extraneous variables or study limitations must also be considered. So first, under this design, we have survey studies. So survey studies are investigations in which self-report data are collected from samples with the purpose of describing populations on some variables of interest. Surveys have probably been conducted as long as humankind has been in existence. Probably everyone who is listening to me right now has been involved in some type of survey. If you have watched Family Feud, for example, kung saan nasa-survey sila ng mga tao about certain topics or questions, then you may have an idea about survey studies. Probability sampling techniques and adequate sample sizes are very important in survey research. Surveys generally ask subjects to report their attitudes, opinions, perceptions, or behaviors. A nurse researcher might use a survey naman to gather data on the health needs of clients, their sleep patterns, or their perceptions of the nursing care they have received. Surveys may be conducted by phone, mail, the internet, or through personal contacts with the subjects. So the most common data collection techniques in survey research are questionnaires and interviews. So in surveys, participants may be studied using a cross-sectional or longitudinal approach. So for cross-sectional survey, subjects are studied at one point in time. Longitudinal surveys follow subjects over an extended period of time. Mamaya I'll give you more information about cross-sectional and longitudinal terms. Advantages ng survey studies. One of the chief virtues of survey research is its ability to provide accurate information on populations while using relatively small samples. Another advantage of survey research concerns the large amount of data that can be obtained rather quickly and with a minimal cost. Ang disadvantage naman, however, self-report responses may be unreliable because people may provide socially acceptable responses. So that is for the survey studies. Second, we proceed with correlational studies. So the researcher examines the strength of relationships between variables by determining how changes in one variable are associated with changes in another variable. So a correlation indicates the extent to which one variable, or x, related to another variable, which is y. As x increases, does y increase or decrease? So, yun yung pwede nating itanong when we use correlation. In a simple correlational study, one group of subjects is measured on two variables, that is x and y, to determine if there is a relationship between these variables. Other correlational studies may examine the relationship among more than two variables. A famous research dictum, correlation does not prove causation. Tandaan, pag correlational studies, correlation does not prove causation. The mere existence of a relationship between variables is not enough to conclude that one variable caused the other, even if the relationship is strong. So the magnitude and direction of relationships between two variables is indicated by correlation coefficient. So correlation coefficients may be positive or negative and range from -1.0, that is perfect negative correlation, to 1.0, that is perfect positive correlation. Okay, if the correlation coefficient has no sign in front of it, example, 0.80 lang siya, ibig sabihin a positive relationship exists. A negative correlation coefficient is preceded by a negative sign. Example, negative 0.80. So that means negative correlation siya. So a correlation coefficient of 0, or I mean of zero point 0, again, a correlation coefficient of 0.0 or zero point 0 na lang, indicates there is no relationship between variables. So, correlation coefficient pa rin. A correlation coefficient are reported through various statistics such as Pearson's product moment correlation, more commonly called as Pearson's R or Pearson R, and the Spearman rule. A positive relationship or direct relationship means that as the value of one variable increases, the value of the other variable increases. So, ganun kapag ka positive relationship or direct relationship. Pag tumaas yung isa, tataas din yung isa. A negative relationship naman or inverse relationship means that as the value of one variable increases, the value of the other variable decreases. So, opposite naman kapag ka negative relationship or inverse yung kanilang relationship. As one variable increases, the other variable decreases. So, correlation coefficient, the identification of an IV and DV may not be appropriate in some correlational studies. Generally, however, the independent variable is that variable that comes first in chronological order and that influences the other variable. Okay, for example, if you're trying to determine if there is correlation between age and assertiveness levels, the IV would be age and the DV would be assertiveness levels. The subject's age is a non-manipulated inherent variable that exists in time or chronological order before the variable of assertiveness. Even if a strong correlation were found between these two variables, the researcher should not conclude that age causes assertiveness. So there may be some other variables that bring about the assertiveness levels of people. So advantages, correlational research can offer an efficient way to collect large amounts of data about a problem. So for example, it would be possible to collect information about people's health problems and eating habits. So researchers could then examine which problems correlate with which eating patterns. By doing this, many relationship could be discovered in a short time. Ang disadvantage naman ng correlational studies, they do not yield persuasive evidence for causal inferences. So this is not a problem when the aim is description, but correlational studies are often undertaken to discover causes. Yet, correlational studies are susceptible to faulty interpretation because groups being compared have formed through self-selection. A researcher doing a correlational study cannot assume that the groups being compared were similar before the occurrence of the IV. So the third one na i-discuss natin for non-experimental design is comparative studies. So comparative studies examine the differences between intact groups on some dependent variable of interest. So this description may sound like the aim of many experimental studies. The difference is the difference between comparative studies and experimental studies lies in the researcher's ability to manipulate the independent variable. In comparative studies, there is no manipulation of the IV, right? Frequently, the IV is some inherent characteristic of the subjects, such as personality type, educational level, or medical condition. There are many reasons for the choice of comparative research design. One reason involves the ethics of research. When human subjects are studied, the manipulation of the IV may not be possible. So, a researcher could not examine child abuse as an independent variable in an experimental study. It would not be ethical to select one group of children who would receive abusive treatment and another group of children who would not receive abusive treatment. However, the researcher could choose a group of children who had experienced abuse during their life and compare them with a group of children who had not been abused. So the dependent variable might be self-esteem, for example. So comparative studies are frequently classified as retrospective or prospective. So ito yung again, no, like a type of comparative studies. Retrospective studies, so the dependent variable or the effect is identified in the present. It could be a disease condition, for example, and an attempt is made to determine the independent variable, the cause of the disease that occurred in the past. So, ibig sabihin, retrospective studies are frequently called ex post facto. Pag sinabing ex post facto studies, data are collected after the fact. So variations in the IV are studied after the variations have occurred rather than at the time of the occurrence. So for example, A researcher might be interested in the fear responses of children during physical examinations. A study might be conducted to examine previous unpleasant experiences during physical exams that might have influenced the children's present behaviors. So these previous experiences might be considered the cause, and the present fear responses might be the effect. So a retrospective study starts by examining an effect and then looks back in time to determine the cause. So yun yung ating retrospective study. Next, you have prospective studies, also called as cohort design. The independent variable or presumed cause, such as, for example, high cholesterol blood levels, is identified at the present time, then subjects are followed in the future to observe the dependent variable, such as, for example, incidence of coronary artery disease. Experimental studies are inherently prospective because the researcher institutes the intervention and subsequently examines its effect. A prospective study starts with determination of a cause and then looks forward in time to determine the effect of the subject on the subjects. Example: a well-publicized study concerning Agent Orange and Vietnam veterans. During the war in Vietnam, many American servicemen were exposed to the chemical defoliant Agent Orange. After years of examining the effects of this chemical on veterans and their offspring, the Air Force finally issued a report in 1984 that revealed some of the problems linked with exposure to the herbicide Agent Orange, which was named after the color-coded bands on storage drums. Among the problems found were high rates of benign skin lesions, liver disorders, leg pulses that could indicate hardening of the arteries, and minor birth defects in their children. So that is the Agent Orange study noong 1984. So prospective studies may use an experimental approach, whereas retrospective studies would never use this type of design. In prospective studies, the researcher might manipulate the IV or the cause, then observe study participants in the future for the dependent variable or the effect. Prospective studies are costly and subject dropout may occur. And then these types of studies are less common than retrospective studies. And that's about it for our non-experimental design. So this is just an FYI. So we're done with the quantitative research design, no? So the experimental tsaka non-experimental. So for an FYI about time dimension in research design. So research design, kasi maririnig nyo rin to, no? Or I'm sure narinig nyo na to when you have conducted your previous research. So research designs incorporate decisions about when and how often data will be collected. And studies can be categorized in terms of how they deal with time. So we have first the cross-sectional designs. So pag sinabing cross-sectional designs, data are collected at one point in time. For example, a researcher might study whether psychological symptoms in menopausal women are correlated contemporaneously with physiologic symptoms. See, retrospective studies are usually cross-sectional. Data on the IV and outcome variables are collected concurrently. Example, participants' lung cancer status and smoking habits. But the IV usually concerns events or behaviors occurring in the past. So cross-sectional designs can be used to study time-related phenomena, but they are less persuasive than longitudinal designs. So cross-sectional designs are economical, but they pose problems for inferring changes over time. The amount of social and technological change that characterizes our society makes it questionable to assume that differences in the behaviors or characteristics of different age groups are the result of the passage through time rather than cohort differences. And then yung longitudinal designs, it involved collecting data multiple times over an extended period. So such designs are useful for studying changes over time and for establishing the sequencing of phenomena, which is a criterion for inferring causality. So in nursing research, longitudinal studies are often follow-up studies of a clinical population undertaken to assess the subsequent status of people with a specified condition or who receive an intervention. So, for example, patients who receive a smoking cessation intervention could be followed up to assess its long-term effectiveness. As a non-experimental example, samples of premature infant could be followed up to assess subsequent motor development. So, in longitudinal studies, researchers must decide the number of data collection points and the time intervals between them. When change is rapid, numerous data collection points at relatively short intervals may be required to understand transitions. By convention, however, the term longitudinal applies multiple data collection points over an extended period of time. A challenge in longitudinal studies is the loss of participants or attrition over time. So note lang, not all longitudinal studies are prospective because sometimes the IV occurred even before the initial wave of data collection. And not all prospective studies are longitudinal in the classic sense. For example, an experimental study that collects data at 1, 2, and 4 hours after an intervention would be prospective but not longitudinal. Example data are not collected over a long period of time. So again, for the second part, I'll just enumerate here the list of qualitative research designs that are commonly used since ang focus ng lesson na ito ay quantitative research design. So the most common types of qualitative research designs are phenomenology, ethnography, grounded theory, case study, narrative inquiry, and historical research. A detailed discussion of this design can be accessed in the ebooks I have sent in our GCR. Please refer to those ebooks for further details. And that concludes my discussion for this lesson. Now that you know the common designs, try to come up with a research design that will best fit your current study. So thank you for listening. And as always, if you have questions, you can raise them when we meet online. Thank you very much and God bless.